The palace walls still whisper of her screams. Stone absorbs sound differently than air. It keeps a memory, a haunting echo that clings to the halls long after the body is gone. Arsinoe was born into a dynasty that carried beauty in its blood, but rot in its veins. Egypt saw her family as gods. In truth, they were devourers, feeding on their own children. She was not yet 10 when she learned what power meant. Power was not a crown, nor a throne, nor a coin struck with her father's name. Power was a locked door, the smell of oil lamps burning too long, and her brother's shadow falling across her face in the night. The dynasty had rules, rules no child could understand, rules written in blood. A daughter could not belong to the people, she belonged only to the bloodline. And so she was sealed inside its curse. Her father told the world he was keeping the dynasty pure. He told himself he was obeying the will of the gods. But a child knows the difference between reverence and violation. Arsinoe's small body carried bruises where no eyes could see. The priests called her sacred. She called it something else. In her silence, the curse began. Dynasties do not collapse in a single moment, they unravel thread by thread. In Arsinoe's time, Egypt was dazzling to the outside world. Gold poured from the mines. Ships came fat with grain. Scholars wrote treatises, astronomers mapped the heavens. Yet in the royal palace, the future of that empire lay in the shaking hands of a girl who could not sleep through the night. A dynasty's face was marble, its heart was a terrified child. Imagine her at 12 watching the Nile flood. The river brought life, but it also drowned. She knew what it was to be both, giver and grave. Her eyes lingered too long on the black waters. Some said the royal children were watched by spirits. Arsinoe knew better. The only spirits that watched her were the shadows of men who wanted to keep her soul caged inside her body. Every dynasty begins to rot from its hidden core. In Arsinoe's family, the rot was not a rumor, it was law. Brothers married sisters. Fathers took daughters. Mothers looked away. They told themselves it was necessary to keep the bloodline divine. But the gods were not watching with favor. They were watching with disgust. When Arsinoe was given to her brother as a bride, the people celebrated. They saw 2 crowns, 2 figures wrapped in gold, the promise of eternity. But what did the girl see? She saw the same shadow at her door, the same hand tightening around her wrist, the same prison disguised as glory. History calls it marriage. Arsinoe called it survival. This is where her curse spread, not in battlefields or decrees, but in the silence she carried. A silence so heavy it sank into the marrow of her bloodline. That silence would poison every king, every queen, every heir that came after her. They would call it fate. They would call it the will of the gods. But it was not divine. It was Arsinoe's burden, passed like an invisible infection through the dynasty. Egypt adored its rulers. They carved their names in stone, built temples that touched the sky, filled the streets with processions. Yet behind every hymn sung in their honor was a secret no priest dared whisper. The people bowed, but the dynasty bled. And all of it began with a girl too young to understand why her body became the battlefield of gods and men. Arsinoe's eyes were dark, ancient beyond her years. Witnesses said she carried a look that unsettled even seasoned generals. She had seen too much. She understood what no child should, that kingdoms are built not on stone and gold but on flesh, on what is taken and what is broken. The dynasty flourished on the outside. On the inside it was already dying. And Arsinoe, silent, haunted Arsinoe, was the first crack in its divine mask. The years that followed did not heal her, they sharpened her. Pain has 2 roads. One leads to silence, the other to hunger. Arsinoe learned to walk both. She obeyed in public, bowed where the priests demanded, and stood beside her brother with the perfect posture of a queen. But inside she was plotting. Every bruise had become a seed. Every night of fear was a lesson in survival. And survival, in dynasties like hers, meant learning to strike before you were swallowed. Her brother, proud in his crown, never saw her watching. He believed he owned her. But ownership is an illusion. Arsinoe studied the rhythms of power like others studied scripture. She memorized who whispered to whom, who glanced too long at the floor, who drank too much wine at night. She was young, but she was learning that empires are not destroyed by armies, they are destroyed by secrets. By the time she was 16, the court had already begun to fracture. A dynasty rots quietly until one day the smell is too strong to hide. Arsinoe carried herself like a goddess, but behind her eyes was calculation. She knew her brother's weaknesses, his appetites, his arrogance, his blind trust in ritual. The priests thought she was fragile. The generals thought she was beautiful. Both were wrong. She was something else entirely, patient. One night, when the lamps burned low and the palace fell into its usual silence, Arsinoe decided her silence would no longer serve. She whispered her first betrayal into the ear of a servant. A rumor spread like a shadow, crawling under doors, slipping through markets, reaching even the temples. They said the gods were angry. They said the brother king had broken the divine law. No one mentioned Arsinoe's name, but she did not need credit. She only needed doubt. Dynasties do not die from a sword to the heart, they die when the people's faith cracks. Arsinoe had taken the first hammer to the mask of divinity. The throne still gleamed, but the whispers had begun. When her brother fell, he did not fall in battle. He fell in shame. The same shadow that had haunted Arsinoe now clung to him. Soldiers hesitated in his presence. Priests recited blessings with forced smiles. The people bowed but less deeply. And Arsinoe stood beside him, her eyes still dark, still ancient, carrying the silence of everything she had endured. She did not need to lift a hand, the dynasty was already poisoning itself. But power is a curse that never sleeps. With her brother gone, the throne looked to her. The people saw beauty, poise, and youth. They did not see the scars. They did not hear the screams echoing in the marble. To them, Arsinoe was a goddess reborn. To herself, she was a wound that had learned to walk upright. She wore the crown, but the crown wore her down. Every decree she signed, every procession she led, every temple carved with her name, it was all an attempt to convince the world that the dynasty was still divine. Yet inside, she knew it was nothing but rot-wearing perfume. She knew the truth, she was not a goddess. She was the evidence of the gods' disgust. Her silence, that unbearable silence she had carried since childhood, began to seep into the halls of power. Servants spoke in whispers as though afraid to disturb something unseen. Generals second-guessed their orders. Priests avoided her eyes. It was as if the whole palace had inherited her dread. The dynasty, once unshakable, was now trembling from within. And Arsinoe? She never forgot the child she had been, locked behind doors, watching the shadows move. That child never left her. It lived in her crown, in her throne, in her smile. She was both queen and ghost, ruling but already cursed to haunt. The dynasty looked eternal. In truth, it was already doomed. Arsinoe had not destroyed it. She had simply revealed what it had always been. Fragile, hollow, and bleeding from its own hidden sins, the palace corridors reeked of perfume, but beneath the fragrance lingered the stench of treachery. Arsinoe's name was whispered in half-lit halls, a princess not yet fully a woman but already a target. Her beauty, her youth, her bloodline, all of it was both a blessing and a curse. In the royal court, affection was a weapon and love was poison. Every glance at her carried calculation, every smile hid a dagger. Those who claimed loyalty were merely waiting for the perfect hour to betray her. And in the shadows of Alexandria's gilded chambers, the silence was more terrifying than open war. Silence meant someone was plotting. Silence meant her life was dangling over an abyss. Her sister Cleopatra played her role with mastery, weaving charm around Rome's most powerful men. Arsinoe, however, was not granted that shield. She was young, vulnerable, and inconvenient. For Cleopatra to rise, someone had to fall. And so, the court began to treat Arsinoe not as royalty but as a pawn. Her meals were tasted by trembling servants, for every cup of wine might hold the glimmer of death. She slept with one eye open, hearing footsteps echo in the night, never knowing if they belonged to guards, or to assassins creeping closer. The palace, for her, was no sanctuary. It was a coffin waiting to close. It was in this atmosphere of fear that Arsinoe was forced onto the stage of war. Rome's ambition stretched across the Nile, and Egypt's throne was nothing more than a prize for foreign hands. When Julius Caesar stormed into Alexandria, blood flooded the marble floors. The city burned with betrayal, alliances crumbled in an instant, and Arsinoe was thrust forward as a symbol for rebellion. Barely a teenager, she was declared queen by those who hated Caesar's grip. She had not sought power, but power had sought her, a crown of thorns pressed upon her head. And so, Arsinoe led soldiers through streets that echoed with the screams of the dying. Her hands trembled not from cowardice, but from the weight of history crushing her youth. In the chaos, her mind sharpened. She learned that survival was not about innocence but about outlasting cruelty. She discovered that leadership was forged not in triumph but in terror. Every order she gave cost lives, every hesitation carved another wound into her soul. Yet still she fought. And Rome, the beast that devoured nations, began to take notice. The storm of war reached its peak in the brutal clash known as the Siege of Alexandria. Flames devoured the harbor, choking the night sky. Screams carried across the waters as Roman steel carved through Egyptian flesh. Arsinoe, wrapped in armor far too heavy for her young frame, stood atop the battlements, not as a child but as the last defiance of a dynasty. Her presence alone electrified the rebels. They saw in her not fragility but fire. For a moment the tide seemed to bend. Rome stumbled. Caesar bled. And in those brief hours Arsinoe tasted something forbidden: victory. But Rome is not a beast easily slain. Betrayal seeped in like rot. Her allies faltered, her soldiers fell, and the walls crumbled under the relentless storm of Caesar's legions. Dragged from the battlefield, Arsinoe's cries pierced the night as chains bound her wrists. She had fought like a queen, but Rome would display her like a slave. Bloodied, exhausted, her body still radiated defiance. Yet defiance in Rome's eyes was entertainment. Paraded through the streets of Rome, Arsinoe was forced to march in Caesar's triumph, the celebration of his conquest. The crowd roared, not in her honor, but in delight at her humiliation. A foreign princess reduced to a spectacle, her dignity stripped away. And yet, even in chains, Arsinoe's eyes burned with something unbreakable. She would not bow. Not to Caesar. Not to Rome. Not to the jeering mob. Her silent resistance was more dangerous than any blade. For in her defiance, people saw a truth Rome despised: that empires are fragile when one young girl can make them tremble. But empires never forgive humiliation. For a time, Arsinoe was spared execution. Her life dangled on the strings of politics. She was sent into exile, confined to the temple of Artemis in Ephesus, sacred ground where Roman law forbade bloodshed. To the world it seemed a mercy. To Arsinoe it was a cage. Walls gilded in religion, bars made not of iron but of ritual and fear. She lived but she did not live free. Her every movement watched, her every prayer shadowed by the knowledge that mercy in Rome was never permanent. In the silence of exile she carried her memories like chains. The screams of Alexandria, the roar of Rome's crowd, the cold weight of shackles on her skin. She was young, but her eyes had already seen too much of the world's cruelty. The temple walls were not high enough to contain the storms inside her. For Arsinoe, survival was not the same as safety. She knew that as long as Cleopatra lived, as long as Rome thirsted for power, her life was only borrowed time. And every night, as the priests whispered their prayers, Arsinoe whispered her own, not for salvation but for vengeance. The temple at Ephesus glowed with torches at night, its marble columns rising like the ribs of some ancient god. Pilgrims came to bow, priests came to chant, and beneath the chants there was always the faint rustle of spies. Arsinoe walked among the sacred walls, but her footsteps never felt holy. She was not there as a worshipper. She was there as a prisoner dressed in robes of piety. The temple was sanctuary, yes, but it was also a tomb built for the living. She could not leave. She could not rule. She could only wait, caged in a holy silence that mocked her every breath. But silence in her world was never empty. Silence meant plotting. Silence meant a blade was being sharpened in the shadows. Arsinoe knew this truth too well. Mercy in politics is nothing but a delay before the strike. And that strike would come, not from Rome directly but from her own blood. Cleopatra. The sister who had charmed Caesar, who had turned her throne into a theater of seduction and cunning, could not tolerate another claimant to Egypt's crown, even one locked away in a temple. Arsinoe's existence alone was poison to her sister's ambition. Years passed, but years did not soften the knives of envy. Cleopatra's grip on Rome grew stronger, now bound not only to Caesar but, later, to Mark Antony. And every whisper of Arsinoe's name was a reminder that Cleopatra's power was incomplete. The temple was supposed to be untouchable, but in a world ruled by greed and lust, nothing was sacred. One day Rome's messengers arrived with quiet orders. Sacred ground would be violated. Blood would spill on marble that had never known execution. And Arsinoe's name would be erased not with politics, but with death. When the soldiers entered the temple, the priests protested, but their voices were drowned beneath the authority of Rome. The columns seemed to shudder as iron boots struck the floor. Arsinoe was dragged from the altar, her cries echoing like the wail of a ghost. The sanctuary was no sanctuary now. It was a stage for her final humiliation. The girl who had once stood against Caesar, who had been paraded in chains but refused to bow, now faced the cold certainty of her end. She did not beg. She did not plead. Instead, her eyes locked on the soldiers with the same fire that had lit the battlements of Alexandria. If she was to die, she would die as she had lived, in defiance. The sword rose, and in that instant, the weight of dynasties, of betrayals, of sisterly hatred and imperial greed, all came crashing down upon her fragile form. Blood stained the temple steps. Sacred ground was broken. And with her death, the world lost not just a princess, but a living reminder that resistance burns even in the youngest of souls. Yet death did not silence her. History buried her beneath Cleopatra's glittering shadow, but her ghost lingers in every tale of betrayal, every whisper of sisters torn apart by power, every warning that even God's temples are not safe from human cruelty. The world would remember Cleopatra as the seductress of Rome, but Arsinoe would remain the specter, young, defiant, wronged, and slaughtered on holy ground. And it is often the ghosts, not the queens, that haunt us the longest. For what is history if not the art of silencing voices like hers? The empire celebrated as if nothing had happened. In Rome, feasts were held and Cleopatra's name rose higher, painted in gold beside Caesar and then Antony. The marble of Ephesus still bore the faint shadow of Arsinoe's blood, but the world moved on as though a sister had not been slaughtered on ground once thought untouchable. This is how history always operates, erasing the inconvenient, polishing the conqueror, burying the victims beneath silence. Yet silence does not last. It rots. It seeps back through cracks. It whispers through time. Arsinoe's story became one of those whispers. Those who had seen her in chains remembered her defiant gaze. Those who had fought beside her in Alexandria remembered her voice above the clash of steel. And those who witnessed her dragged from the altar of Artemis could never forget the desecration of a sacred place. She became a ghost in the minds of men, a reminder that Rome's greatness was built on broken bodies and violated sanctuaries. Every time Cleopatra smiled beside Antony, there were eyes in the crowd who thought not of her beauty, but of the young sister sacrificed to secure that smile. And Rome itself was not spared. The empire that killed Arsinoe would eventually devour its own. Julius Caesar, who had paraded her through the streets, fell beneath the knives of his friends. Mark Antony, who had shared Cleopatra's bed, fell on his sword as his world collapsed. And Cleopatra, the queen who thought herself immortal in charm and power, ended her life with poison pressed to her lips. One by one, the mighty were consumed, while the memory of Arsinoe, the silenced girl, remained unyielding in shadow. What does this tell us? That power is never secure. That those who believe they stand untouchable are often the most fragile. Cleopatra ruled with seduction and calculation, but her dynasty ended in ruin. Rome marched with legions and banners, but even its glory crumbled into dust. Yet Arsinoe, the girl they sought to erase, still lingers in history's darkest corners. Her ghost walks not because she won, but because she dared to fight when defeat was certain. And sometimes, that is what eternity remembers, the refusal to bow even in chains. The tragedy of Arsinoe is not hers alone. It is the tragedy of every silenced voice, every victim erased so that rulers might appear divine. It is the tragedy of forgotten resistance, of youth crushed beneath ambition. And as you hear her story, ask yourself, how many more have been buried beneath silence? How many names erased so that power could shine brighter? How many temples broken by blood the world chose to forget? If you are still here, listening, it means her silence has been broken once again. And perhaps that is the only justice history allows, that the ghosts rise even if the queens fall.